Konnichiwa, Kokoro Communications の幸です。In this video, I am going to share with you 4 things that you should keep in mind as a Japanese language learner. These 4 things are great whether you're a beginner or an advanced learner. I grew up bilingual, I'm a translator and Japanese and English teacher now, and these are things that I keep in mind all the time, whether I'm translating or teaching. Make sure to stick around until the end of the video because I'll be sharing some tips along the way. If you enjoy it, please like, comment, and consider subscribing. Number 1. Particles allow for flexible grammar. Unlike English, which has fairly strict word order, Japanese has flexible word order because it uses particles. If we have a sentence in English like the dog drank water, we could potentially flip the words around and say the water drank the dog, but no matter what situation you're in, these 2 sentences will never mean the same thing. Japanese works differently because the particles come immediately after the noun and it tells us what the function of that noun is within the sentence, which means word order can be flexible within the sentence. So let's consider going back to the sentence we were just talking about. The dog drank water. In Japanese, we might say inu ga mizu wo nonda. Even if we flip the order of the nouns around like we did in English and Japanese from inu ga mizu wo nonda to mizu wo inu ga nonda, these 2 sentences still mean the same thing. You might notice that one sentence feels a little bit more natural than the other, and that's because there is a preferred word order in Japanese, but both sentences are still grammatically correct. Let's look at a more complex sentence. 私が母のメモ帳にメッセージを書いた. I wrote a note in my mother's notepad. If we split the sentence, after each particle, we end up with 5 parts, 4 nouns and 1 verb. Even though there are a whole bunch of different possible options where we could reorder these 5 components, there are 6 possible ways to order this sentence and still have it mean the same thing. 私がメッセージを母のメモ帳に書いた. 母のメモ帳に私がメッセージを書いた. 母のメモ帳にメッセージを私が書いた. メッセージを私が母のメモ帳に書いた. メッセージを母のメモ帳に私が書いた. You'll notice that the verb kaita is always at the end of the sentence, and haha no memocho, these 2 nouns are always together and always in that specific order. Although there are some restrictions and some preferences within Japanese, as a translator and language teacher, this word order is something that I'm constantly thinking about because sometimes the best one can change depending on the context. I also find that my beginner and elementary level Japanese language students are constantly asking me about word order in Japanese, so no matter what level your Japanese is at, this is something that you probably want to be thinking about and considering depending on the context. 2. Rhythm. You probably already know that the rhythm of Japanese is very different from the rhythm of English. English is a stress time language, whereas Japanese is a mora-timed language. I've seen a lot of people say that Japanese is a syllable-based language, and I do understand that in the sense that it might be easier for people to understand what a syllable is as compared to a mora, but syllables are actually not the same as moras. I won't go into the details of what a mora is at the moment, except to say that a mora is a rhythmic unit of timing. Most of the time in Japanese, 1 kana is 1 mora. So if we have a, I, u, e, o, these are 1 mora each. A small tsu or chisai tsu is 1 mora as well, and long vowels in Japanese are 2 moras. Exceptions come into play when you have small ya, yu, and yo. Chisai ya, yu, yo ですね、これは. So when you have, for example, kya, kyu, kyo, or bya, byu, byo, for example. There are lots of different combinations of these in Japanese. Whatever comes with that small ya, small yu, small yo, together they are 1 mora. One easy way to count mora and keep a good rhythm when speaking Japanese is to, for example, clap your hands, tap your leg, tap a wall, whatever it is, to keep timing. Let's take a look at a few words. Sora, the word for sky, has 2 mora. So, ra. Shoppai, the word for salty, has 4 mora. Sho, the small yo gets grouped with the shi together to make the sho sound. The chisai tsu is 1 mora on its own. A and i are pretty straightforward. They are 1 mora each. Yubin-kyoku, or post office, has 6 mora. Yu-bi-n-kyoku. The long vowels in Japanese are 2 mora, so the yu, u are 1 mora each. Japanese rhythm is not particularly a problem for me because I grew up speaking both languages, but I have met a number of native English speakers who are advanced level Japanese language learners, but they still have a little bit of a difficult time with rhythm. Other mora-timed languages include Gilbertese, Slovakian, Classical Latin, and others, but if you speak French, Spanish, Icelandic, Cantonese, Mandarin, Turkish, or Korean, this will help you with the rhythm of Japanese. One great way to improve your rhythm of speaking Japanese is to shadow. There are lots of great benefits from shadowing, and this is one of them. I wrote a bilingual post about shadowing, so I'll leave the link to that in the description down below. There are also lots of other great videos on YouTube on how to shadow, so feel free to check those out as well. Number 3, pitch accent. Although region and dialect influence pitch accent, standard Japanese is considered to have 4 different pitch accent patterns. They are atamadaka, nakadaka, odaka, and heiban. Now just remember that these pitch accent patterns always consider and take into account the particles that immediately follow each word. Atamadaka means head high, and this is the pattern where the pitch starts off high and then drops down and levels out. Nakadaka means middle high, and this is when one of the middle mora gets the highest pitch. It's never the first, never the last, it's somewhere in the middle, which depends on how long the word is as well. Odaka means tail high, so this is when the pitch accent is on the last mora of the word. So it's lower at the beginning of the word, ends high, and then the following particle is low again. The last pattern, called heiban, meaning flat, is when the word starts out low. It kind of increases a little bit, but it never fully reaches the height of an accented mora. Let's take a look at some examples. Hashi can mean bridge, chopsticks, or edge, depending on the accent pattern and the context. If you just hear the word by itself, you might think there are only 2 possible patterns, hashi and hashi. But it's easier for us to know which accent pattern this word falls into when there is a particle that follows it. Let's use ga as our particle. Hashi ga with the odaka pattern means bridge. Hashi ga, the heiban pattern, means the edge. Hashi ga, which falls into the atamadaka pattern, means chopsticks. What makes Japanese accent patterns fun is that non-native Japanese language learners will almost always learn the standard Japanese accent. But if you learn a dialect that's considered to be non-standard Japanese, you will learn different accent patterns, since dialect and region heavily influence Japanese accent patterns. Last but most definitely not least, adjusting your tone, vocabulary, and grammar to match the circumstances is incredibly important in Japanese. In order to speak with someone in an appropriate manner, you need to know what their status is and what your relationship to that person is. How you speak to a baby, how you speak to your friends and close family members, how you speak to a stranger on the street, how you speak to your boss or a client is all going to be different. When non-native Japanese speakers learn Japanese, they'll learn, or you'll learn, the standard level of formality with desu and masu. Desu masu can be used with strangers on the street or with anyone that you want to speak with an average level of formality. It might sound pretty strange to speak to a baby with desu masu, and it can also be considered quite rude if you speak to your boss or a potential client with just this average level form of formality. Let me give you a few examples. Hand is te in Japanese, but when most adults speak to small children or babies, they'll probably say otete. If they're training a dog, for example, then they'll probably say ote. Let's say you're talking about eating. In a standard conversation, you might use taberu. In a setting of average formality, you'll probably use tabemasu. But if you are in a formal or business setting, you'll probably use meshiagaru or itadaku, depending on who is doing the eating. Types of formality in Japanese include but are not limited to teineigo, kinjougo, and sonkeigo. Formal and business Japanese isn't always easy, but the need to think about which level of formality to use in a conversation is something that even people who have only ever lived in Japan constantly need to do. As someone who uses Japanese with friends, family, and at work all the time, this is something that I think about all the time as well. But don't worry, over time it does get much easier. Japanese is a very different language from English, so certain concepts might be a little bit difficult depending on which stage you are in the learning process. But have fun and enjoy even the smallest of wins along the way. I hope you found this video interesting, insightful, and helpful. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. I'd also love to hear from you, so please consider leaving a comment down below. 最後までご視聴いただきありがとうございました。では次回の動画でお会いしましょう。